Some people will say that if you want to get into X-Men comics, you have to start all the way at the beginning in 1963 with issue 1. But those people are all, wrong. When I was about 11, my sister saw me reading my black and white essential volume of X Factor. We're talking early X Factor, like Rusty and Skids and Artie and Leech and Boom Boom. Classic stuff. And she thought it looked interesting, so she asked if she could read it, to which I said, absolutely, but let me get you some context first. So I gathered together all the issues of X-Men that I had available to me that I thought would be necessary in understanding and appreciating X Factor, and I gave it to her and said, here, read this first. And the stack was about that tall. And of course she saw that stack and said, I'm not reading that. And I'm actually not sure if she ever ended up reading X Factor, but I learned a valuable lesson that day about gatekeeping. If you like the X-Men and you want to get started reading X-Men comics, then you should start wherever you feel like. Whatever looks interesting to you, that's where you should start. Just because I happen to be exposed to X-Men comics in almost exactly chronological order doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. So today I'm going to talk about some great jumping on points in X-Men comics where you will most likely have the least confusion and the most enjoyment. And I've organized this video chronologically, not by value of jumping on point, so just because we're starting in 1963 doesn't mean that's the best place for you to jump on. And, you know, like and subscribe, sacrifice a virgin to me, all that good stuff, whatever. So certainly a place to start is all the way back at issue 1 from 1963. If you start here, you will have the least confusion, but you're probably not going to enjoy it very much. Even I barely enjoy the really old X-Men stuff, and that's mostly coming from a place of appreciation for the history. If you start at the beginning, you get to see all the first appearances, like the Sentinels and Juggernaut and Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and the Blob and all that stuff. But honestly, if you read later issues, they're probably just going to explain those characters anyway. The most common way for people to read these issues in person, if they're not reading them on their phone, is through like Marvel Masterworks or through an omnibus, but honestly I don't like these reprintings very much because they just don't do the colors any justice. They're just too bright and flat, and they don't reflect how stressed and textured the colors were back in the 60s. There is a series of floppy issues that reprints the first 8 issues of X-Men, and that's way more affordable than the actual issues. It's called Amazing Adventures, and it does only go through the first 8 issues, but if you want to see those authentic colors and you don't want to spend $1 million, then that's definitely a way you can go. Most people don't start reading X-Men all the way at the beginning, and I can't blame them. A good chunk of people will skip to Giant Size X-Men number 1. That's the second genesis of X-Men from 1975. This is where we get a lot of the characters that you're probably used to, like Colossus and Storm and Wolverine and Nightcrawler. From this point, you would jump over to issue 93 of X-Men, and I consider this era going through about issue 167. This era of X-Men is so good, it is the reason why people even know about X-Men now. Chris Claremont and John Byrne in particular made X-Men the massive blockbuster hit that it became. We have top-of-the-line stories like Days of Future Past and the Dark Phoenix Saga. We introduced dozens of characters, including Moira McTaggart, Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, the Hellfire Club, Alpha Flight. It's just so good. It's some of the greatest X-Men comics ever. They make plenty of collected editions in color, but again, you don't get the same authentic, stressed colors that you would from the original printings. But if you can't afford the original printings and you still want to see the colors, then Classic X-Men is a great way to read the issues without spending a ton of money. Starting with issue 1, Classic X-Men has an abridged version of Giant Size X-Men number 1, and then it jumps into issue 94 and goes from there. It also has lots of backup stories that help really flesh out the characters and also give the original writer a chance to change little things that he thinks he could have done better the first time. The only problem that I have with Classic X-Men is that it doesn't seem to reprint the Days of Future Past storyline, which is a very important X-Men story. But anyway, second genesis, starting in Giant Size X-Men 1 and going up through issue about 167, is definitely one of my favorite places for people to jump into X-Men comics. Around this time, when X-Men was getting huge, we had a bunch of spin-off series start to take place, and those are pretty good jumping on points as well. They're not mainstream X-Men stuff, but they are good side X-Men stories. That would be the New Mutants, X Factor, which is the original X-Men after the second Genesis X-Men had taken over the title, and Excalibur, which is a few well-known X-Men pairing up with a couple English heroes in what is some of the greatest X-Men stories ever. But the next mainstream X-Men jumping on point that I'm going to highlight is something that most other people don't highlight in their online list, but it's something that I think leads into one of the greatest, most exciting eras of X-Men, and that starts with issue issue 219 of Uncanny X-Men. Now, it's kind of a random issue, and yeah, a bunch of important stuff like the Mutant Massacre happened right before it, but this issue is a great jumping on point for leading into the Outback era of X-Men. Following issue 219, we have things like the first appearance of Mr. Sinister, which leads directly into the Fall of the Mutants event, which isn't exactly the best story I've ever read, but it does have consequences that lead directly to the Rumble in the Outback era of X-Men starting in issue 229. And then in that era, we have great storylines like the return of the Brood, the first appearance of Genosha, the classic Inferno storyline, and the first appearance of Jubilee, as well as many other great stories. The reason that I think all of that starts in issue 219 is because in this issue, we're following this character Havoc, who has no idea what's going on in the lives of the X-Men. He just has a bad feeling about the X-Men, and he wants to figure out why. So he goes to find them in New York, and he finds them living in the sewer because they just went through some real insanity. And from Havoc's point of view, we get totally caught up with what's going on with the X-Men, and then it's a great launching point into what becomes the Rumble in the Outback era. Between issues 200 and 218, we had seen a massive shift in the status quo of the X-Men, and this is a great point in stabilizing the new status quo. So I'm sure all of this is available in some kind of reprint. I'm sure it has an omnibus by now, but if you want to buy the single issues and see the real colors, it's pretty affordable. Most issues are $2 or $3. And that's the good stuff. That's my sweet spot for sure. The next jumping on point that I have for X-Men is X-Men #1 from 1991. This is the X-Men at their peak of popularity. They had the TV show, they had all their toys coming out, they were in every single Pizza Hut across the country. This is like a massive reset button on the X-Men. They're back in the mansion, they know what they're doing, they have organized teams, and everybody's capable of saving the world. Chris Claremont started the series with Jim Lee, and that's a great combination, but unfortunately Claremont was gone after just a few issues. Jim Lee continued for a little while, but he left too eventually for Image Comics. If you start in this era of X-Men comics, don't bother with the Uncanny X-Men stuff that's parallel. Just read the main X-Men series, and if you have crossovers into Uncanny X-Men, fine, read those too. But everything really important in the history of X-Men comics happens within the X-Men title, really within the next 50 issues or so. And these are also super cheap. You can find most of these issues in dollar bins in pretty much any comic store you go to. If you're super nostalgic about the TV show, this is probably where you want to start for the closest thing to that show. The next one I'm not entirely sure about. Everybody says that New X-Men by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely is a great jumping on point for X-Men, and I'm not totally convinced. Yes, it's a welcome return to status quo a decade after the last milestone we talked about, and yes, it is new X-Men for the new millennium with their own flavor of X-Men comics that we haven't really seen before, and yes, it is some of my favorite X-Men comics to read. I think it's very thought-provoking and profound and well-written, but it does require knowing a little bit more lore than the other jumping on points. It's kind of dense and complicated, which is pretty typical for Grant Morrison. If you're willing to be a little bit confused for the first few issues, it is a great series. The 35 or so issues that Morrison did are some of the greatest X-Men comics I've ever read, but I've read these issues 3 or 4 times at least, and I still can't explain to you off the top of my head what really happens because it's kind of complicated. So if you're up for a challenge and you want some X-Men stories that you can really dig into, then this is a great jumping on point for you. Next, we got another one of my favorite jumping on points in X-Men comics, probably my second favorite after Rumble in the Outback. It's Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. Ooh, these 24 issues and a couple specials are just so good. They are X-Men at their best. It is profound writing. John Cassaday's art is gorgeous. We do start with some nostalgia for the old stuff, but it's not anything that's really confusing. It's not anything you have to know to appreciate the story. And then we get right into a new team, new villains, new premise. It's all very exciting and shiny and well written. Before reading this series, really the only thing that you have to know is that Jean Grey just died again, right at the end of Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, and Cyclops was kind of already involved with Emma Frost, so they're together starting in issue 1 here. Other than that, you're good to go, have fun, you're gonna love it. The next jumping on point that I have is one that I often don't see in other people's lists as well, and it's Manifest Destiny, which happens around issue 500 of Uncanny X-Men. Now, if you know your X-Men comics, you know that I skipped over House of M, and that's because I don't think House of M is a good jumping on point for people who don't know much about the X-Men already. House of M is the root of a very big problem in the mutant community that lasts for 5 years real time, and it leads to Disassembled and Endangered Species and Second Coming and eventually Manifest Destiny. But it is not a new status quo that you can get comfortable in and then handle new developments. It is the shift in status quo that leads to a bunch of new developments, and it's honestly not a good jumping on point. So instead of confusing yourself, jump straight into Manifest Destiny, where we finally have New Mutant births. The X-Men are at the top of their game. They're moving out to San Francisco. From Manifest Destiny, we move into Utopia, which is when the X-Men start living on Asteroid M, which is floating in the harbor outside San Francisco. And then we have Nation X, which is some of my favorite X-Men stories, honestly. All of this era is only about 44 issues, so it's really easy to tackle, and it leads into things like Schism and Wolverine and the X-Men, and eventually Avengers vs. X-Men, which is a pretty good series. So if you want some modern X-Men comics that are a lot of fun and really easy on the eyes and have consistently good storytelling, then this is a great era for you to jump into. The next jumping on point that I have is one that I'm a little bit cautious about. I'm not sure if it's a great jumping on point, and that's All New X-Men by Brian Michael Bendis. This series was huge. People loved it. It shook the X universe, and it was a lot of fun. I was really enjoying it for a little while. After the Battle of the Atom event, which was okay, I guess, it kind of just kept going when it should have stopped. Really, I think the series could have been capped at issue 18 and we didn't really need any more, but it just kept going and going. And then as soon as we get out of 2013, starting in 2014, every X-Men comic between then and 2019 is just not good. Like, listen, I read all of the X-Men comics, okay? I spent 3 years tracking down and reading every single X-Men comic, and 2014 through 2019 was probably the hardest era for me to get through because it was so boring and nothing mattered, and they had a bunch of talent that wasn't really talented and nothing was really happening. But the first 18 issues or so of All New X-Men from 2013 are actually pretty good. You'll have a lot of fun with them. You'll get to see the old characters being brought into the now, and it is worth reading even if only those 18 issues. And then of course the final jumping on point that I have in this video is House of X, Powers of X from 2019. Jonathan Hickman came to X-Men and we were all so excited because he clearly had a plan, he clearly loved the characters, and he was doing something new and fresh. And we had about a year of that before the Krakoan era just got terrible. But the initial 12 issues of House of X and Powers of X are really great X-Men stories. If you don't know much about the X-Men before reading these, you will probably be confused. And a lot of the really emotional scenes in the stories are because we have the context of all of the trials and tribulation that the X-Men went through before this, so if you haven't read all of those, it's probably not going to hit you as hard. But it is a very fresh, exciting, well-written new status quo for the X-Men. So if you saw anything in this video that looks really interesting and you want to go grab it for yourself, please consider buying it from an actual retail location. Go to a comic store and buy the comics from them. You don't have to be buying individual issues. I'm sure that they'd be happy to sell you a graphic novel or an omnibus, or if they don't have an omnibus in stock, I'm sure they would love to order one for you. If we don't support the comic stores, then we don't have places to sell the comics, and if we're not selling individual comics and we're just going to have comics online, we'll be looking at pictures on the internet, which is lame. If you can, find some old copies of these issues so you can have the full textural experience of an old comic book. The pulpy feel of the newsprint, the way they smell, the way they taste if you're into that. Just whatever you do, don't buy omnibuses for all these stories from Amazon, because I'm sure the comic stores will even ship to you. If you don't want to go to a comic store, if you don't know where the comic stores are, if they're too far away from you, there are comic stores that ship to you. So if you saw something you like, go buy it from a comic store, and if you think there should have been something on this list that wasn't on this list, drop a comment below. And until next time, rise and grind, don't crease those spines.